So I want to go ahead and start the panel off. I will do our introductions, and hopefully by the time all the panelists are done with their presentations, we'll have Diana back up and ready to support with a discussion and answering questions in the Q&A. So first up, I'd like to introduce Catherine, or Kathy Sandoval. She is a former commissioner with the California Public Utilities Commission, and she currently works at University of Santa Clara Law School. So I'm going to bring her up to the stage. Catherine, you should be getting that note now to turn on your camera and your microphone. In addition to that, we also have Stephen Ritchie joining us today. He is with the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission. So Steve, I will be also making you a presenter right now so you can join the stage. And last but not least, we have, including Diana. Oh, give me 1 second here. Hi, Kathy.
Good morning, everybody.
And last but not least, we have Tony Meyers. He is with the Delta Conveyance Office. He's their executive director. So Tony, I am making you a speaker. You should be able to join. And so if you could all come to the stage, Steve, you included, there should be a button to have your mic and camera on. That would be great. All right, hi, Tony.
Hello.
All right, excellent. So not sure where Steve is, but that's okay. I'll track him down. I want to go ahead and kick us off with Kathy, you giving your presentation. So Tony, feel free to take yourself off the screen, turn off your camera. Perfect. And Kathy, feel free to share your screen and get us started.
Okay, great. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much, Brianne, and thank you to Alma and to Victor and to the whole Well familia. So it's really great to be here. Sorry that we can't be together in person, but looking forward to being able to discuss with you some of the issues involving preparing our water infrastructure for the next 100 years. So this seems to be taking a little bit of time to load. Brianne, I might need some help. So I pushed the share screen and it seems to be loading, but taking a while. So let me start talking through my presentation while we try to get it running. So and maybe I know Brianne has a PowerPoint, so maybe she can do it. So should I just click this one off? So I can stop that share. Oops. Oh, I think I did. Okay. All right. So Brianne, are you going to try to pull up my PowerPoint?
Yes, I'm pulling it up right now.
Okay. Thank you very much. So part of what I wanted to talk about when we think about this big picture of preparing our water infrastructure for the next 100 years, first of all, I'd like to thank Well for putting forth this audacious question to make us think in century terms as we think about water infrastructure, not just for today, but for the next 100 years. And why is the next 100 years important as we think about preparation? Because as you know, when you do water cases or water planning, you're often looking at maybe a 3-year rate case cycle. You're trying to figure out what the rates are going to be for next year, for the next few years, and what the investments are. A lot of water infrastructure investments, we think about useful life often as 30 years. Some things might have a slightly longer useful life. But in general, we're not really planning for the next 100 years. But this is where that type of planning and thinking is very helpful, because it helps us to take the big view to think about what we need to do in terms of broad infrastructure investments, conservation investments, and investments at the local level as well as at the system level. So one of the main things that is really making it so important to take this long view is climate change. And with climate change, we're seeing rising temperatures. So Brianna's pulled up my PowerPoint. So if you could slide 2, perfect. So if you can move it to presentation mode. So we're seeing, next slide, please. Great. So we're seeing rising temperatures in many places around the globe. So the planet's average surface temperature has risen about a little more than 2 degrees Fahrenheit since the late 19th century. And this change is largely driven by increased carbon dioxide and other human-made emissions into the atmosphere.
Okay, so now I'm listening to Kathy's presentation.
Okay, so I'm hearing somebody else too. Thank you. So most of the warming has occurred in the past 40 years, with the 6 warmest years on record taking place since 2014. So why is that important to water leaders? Next slide, please, Brianna. So you're all familiar as water leaders with the Earth's water cycle. And so as we look at the water cycle and the cycle of evaporation, precipitation, transpiration, that also leads to the ability to store water either underground through groundwaters and in aquifers, or leads water to flow into rivers and lakes. And we also have in California a large amount of water storage effectively through snowpack. That one of the key things is that warming temperatures from climate change speed the process of evaporation, according to NASA. And the result of this is more rain and flooding in some places and more drought in others. So we get more extremes. So what these results mean is, particularly in California, we're going to tend to be on the more drought side, although Governor Newsom's strike force on actually wildfires talked about that with climate change, California anticipates more seesaw effect and more alternating atmospheric rivers of tremendous rain, as well as periods of long periods of drought. So one of the things that this will mean is earlier snow melt, which leads to both less water storage and more flood risk. So next slide, please. So this next slide will also help us understand what this means for our wonderful state. Unfortunately, declining snowpack and earlier snow melt reduces water availability. And these NASA satellite pictures demonstrate that. So you see on the left a picture of February 2019 and what the snowpack looked like from a NASA satellite, and that here was February 2020 on the right. So we all know 2020 has been a very challenging year with the coronavirus, but it's also a challenging water year. And luckily, I know that electricity demand at home is actually up. I haven't seen what's happened to water demand, but I would imagine that that's up. Industrial demand for water might be down. But as we get into 2021, and we're hoping that with a vaccine, as well as everybody wearing masks, that things will improve for our communities. That it's something that we might see an effect in water demand as well as electricity demand. And of course, when we think about electricity demand, you need to think about effectively the embedded water and energy for for making energy and all sorts of places in the energy life cycle. Next slide, please. So this is another visual that talks about the climate change indicators and where we see indications of changes in snowpack. And then I'll also make this slide available to Brianna. If you haven't had a chance to look at the citation for this NOAA visual infographic on California's drought, I highly recommend it. It has not only great visuals of the drought, but a good analysis of the causes of the drought. And of course, they conclude that the drought was caused by reduced precipitation, but that was also associated with increased temperatures. And one of the great things that we did with the drought was also increase conservation. So next slide, please. So the message of this cheery presentation is that with climate change, the past is not prologue. And this is important because often in water planning, that we look at the last 30 years or as a basis for forecasts or for planning, or the last 10 years to look at water sales. But the last 30 years and even the last 10 years are not necessarily good predictors of what the world is going to look like 30 years from now in 2050, let alone 100 years from now. So with climate change, the past does not predict the future, and this was something that we addressed when I was a commissioner of the California Public Utilities Commission in a decision on balanced water rates. So as I mentioned, that there's also concern that what we're going to see in the future is more climate whipsaw with increasing times of extended drought alternating with atmospheric rivers, which we all know as the Pineapple Express. Remember hearing about that growing up in LA? And shortly after my term ended as a commissioner, as I came back to teaching full-time, we had several Pineapple Expresses and a big flood here in San Jose, which led the Anderson Dam to overtop and then to local flooding, which had a terrible displacement effect, particularly on low-income Latino and Vietnamese communities that were in the floodplain zone. So climate change is going to affect our water resource availability and our need for infrastructure investment. So next slide, please. So closing up here, we think about what do we do with this? So part of what I think we all come back to is our North Star, that the North Star is safe, reliable service at just and reasonable rates, and also a focus on our community, on the people who we serve. And the long view requires a focus on really the entire community, beyond maybe who you are an elected or appointed representative for, but thinking about the entire community and also thinking generationally. So one suggestion is that we need to continue with and in fact accelerate conservation. As I mentioned, during California's more than 5-year drought, California did a tremendous job with conservation, reducing water conservation by approximately 20%, more than that in some places. And I would also mention that Latino communities as well as African American communities were some of the champions in water conservation. So we're often underestimated when we think about who's going to conserve. And studies have shown that Latinos conserve not just for their own water bill, but for their community as well as their familia. We also need to examine marginal water resources, including, of course, conservation first, but also recycled water and even desalinization if we don't have enough water from that. And of course, and this is really important to the work that you do as people who make decisions about spending, is that we also have aging infrastructure, which requires replacement to maintain both safety and reliability, because of course we are committed to drinking water quality and water safety. And in my view, that this is really an opportunity to look at financing mechanisms that go beyond the traditional financing, where what can be a small group or what could be a large group of local ratepayers pay for their infrastructure distribution needs. So we've seen this in many places where the reality is some of this infrastructure was laid 30 years ago, 50 years ago, 75, even 100 years ago. And particularly if you have a small rate base, it becomes very difficult to afford that. So we've had a California water bond, which has been incredibly helpful and really focused at the water distribution and resource level. This is the time, as we're also talking about infrastructure investment, where again, we can be lobbying for some of this infrastructure investment to be made in water and to be made in water at both the local and regional level. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the comments of all of our fellow panelists and to todos at will. Gracias.
Thank you so much, Professor Sandoval. We're so honored to have you here with us. She is the first Latina appointed to the CPUC, as well as the first Latina recipient of a Rhodes Scholarship. So thank you so much for your excellent and sobering presentation. Our next presenter is Steve Ritchie. Steve, please unmute yourself, turn on your camera, and start presenting. Professor Sandoval.
You know, I don't consider myself a superstitious person having this event on Friday the 13th, but now I'm concerned. Steve, if you could please turn on your mic and camera, if you're able to see us presenters here. If not, we can move on and have Tony present first, and I will give Steve a call. So we'll give it just another second, and then Diana will have you introduce Tony if that doesn't work. All right, Perfect. Diana, why don't you rejoin us and have Tony speak while I track down Steve?
Okay, excellent. I'm sure you've heard an introduction of Tony, but one fun fact for Tony is that he is, just previous to his present position, he was the project manager for the Oroville Spillway Recovery Project, which had to be done under very tense circumstances because obviously it needed to be done in a very short period of time, and the completion was critical to the reliable delivery of water to throughout the state. So, Tony, would you please join us by turning on your camera as well as your microphone? He's no stranger to tall tasks. Thank you so much.
Diana, how are you? So let's see if we can't get presentation queued up here. Can everybody see the presentation?
See it, Tony. Thanks.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
All right, so I'm here today and I want to thank you all very much and the well organizers for providing this important conference and this amazing subject that affects every single one of us in California and throughout the rest of the Western United States. Delta Conveyance Project, predictable, dependable, and sustainable water supply for the future. 3 out of 5 Californians depend on water that flows through the Delta. The State Water Project, which, by the way, this year turned 60 years old. So when we talk about aging infrastructure, we're definitely addressing issues on the State Water Project to make sure that we have another full 60 years of help for delivering safe, reasonably good quality and reasonably priced water for the rest of the state. It is part of distributing essential fresh water to homes, businesses, and farmlands throughout California, allowing the state to become the 5th largest economy in the world. And it's not just fresh water to homes and businesses, but it's at the root of safety for those communities, because without adequate water supply for water storage and pressure, you don't have your firefighting opportunities and life safety issues with regards to just maintaining the amount of water necessary for those communities. 2/3 of California's water originates in the north part of the state. 2/3 of its populations is in the southern part of the state. So there is an issue with regards to the locality of the population and the availability of the water, which is why the state has developed, not just through the state itself, but through the federal projects and local projects, so many water conveyance facilities to ensure that where the population centers are, they have adequate water or can obtain it in a reasonably affordable way. 50% of the state's water runs through the Delta. 27 million people, either all or a portion of their water supply, receive that clean, affordable water through the State Water Project, in addition to providing water to 750,000 acres of farmland in the San Joaquin Valley. State, federal, and local water projects throughout the state create the largest publicly built and operated water supply system in the world. And the Bay Delta is the hub of that infrastructure. Not just the hub, but it's also its Achilles heel. And the time to modernize the Delta infrastructure is now, because the risks are mounting. Infrastructure that protects, collects, and moves water through the Delta to California communities throughout the state is outdated and at risk. And it's at risk to seismic activity and risk of major earthquakes. Earthquakes of magnitude of 6.8 or greater, which all of the major faults west of the Delta are capable of achieving. Climate change and sea level rise is another critical one, because sea level rise creates higher tidal influences, which brings more salinity into the Delta. And subsidence of the Delta Islands in and of themselves put increased pressure on the levees for supporting of those levees on the backside. As you can see in that diagram, the dark red areas within the delta have subsidence of 25 to 30 feet. So what did the governor say when he took office in 2019 at his State of the State address? And he's quoted as saying, "We must get this done," which is to mitigate the issues and update the delta facilities for the resilience of our mighty rivers, the stability of our agriculture sector, and to the millions of people that depend on this water every day. So with a big, bold statement like that, what is the process and how should we go about doing that? Well, it's to plan, permit, and build new diversions and conveyance facilities such as a tunnel in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta to safeguard the State Water Project. And it's also to create new conveyance that needs to complement existing and improved through Delta conveyance, and also to promote operational flexibility, protect water quality, and improve aquatic habitat conditions while limiting local impacts. And those were all findings that came out of the Governor's Water Resilience Portfolio that was published July of this year. So the current planning efforts, DWR is the lead agency for the new Delta Conveyance Facility, and it's currently initiating coordination and planning for required state and federal approvals, which are identified here in this exhibit. The proposed project facilities were identified in the notice of preparation, which was published in January of this year, and it identifies new intake facilities on the Sacramento River in the north of the Delta. And as you see on that diagram to the left, that's up at the top of that exhibit. Tunnel reaches and tunnel shafts were identified on two potential alignments of the proposed projects: the central alignment, which is the green or westerly one, and the more easterly one, which is orange, which is on the easterly fringe of the Delta, outside of, down in the main Delta proper, to hopefully identify a little bit better accessibility to the locations. Pumping plants down at the south end, and a forebay also adjacent to that pumping plant, and then some new South Delta conveyance facilities to bring this new facility back into the State Water Project. The flow alternatives that are being considered in the analysis of the environmental document are from 3,000 CFS to 7,500 CFS. The proposed project is a 6,000 CFS project, and currently right now there is no participation with the CVP project or the federal government. If they were to come back into the project, that's what the 7,500 CFS option is, and we're going to make sure that we maintain studying the effects of that. So should they decide to come back in, the environmental process would be available, already certified for them to do that. The project schedule is looking at the department in California being able to sell bonds to fund the major design and construction of the facilities somewhere toward the end of 2024 in the blue across the top. The draft EIR is tracking to be completed in mid-22, with going out for public circulation and comment, and then the final EIR being completed toward the end of 23, and then the permitting to culminate somewhere toward the end of 24, so that it aligns with the bond sale and being able to go out to main design and construction after 2025. The design anticipates that finish up the 100% design sometimes between 2026 and 2030 on the different features and components of the project, and then going out to bid or advertising for bid for construction starting in 2026 and proceeding through 2030 for each of the different infrastructure components. We've gone through an analysis of the preliminary cost assessment of these facilities and looked at it in undiscounted 2020 dollars for this proposed project that's being analyzed in the EIR or the CEQA process. And it's identified that the hard cost construction subtotal is around $8.7 billion, with a 38% contingency, which is consistent with industry standards through the AACE cost estimating standards of 38%. So we're looking right now and feeling pretty comfortable that we have a hard cost of this new facility somewhere in the order of 12.1 billion. The Delta Conveyance Office, DWR's role is as the lead agency responsible for the project and in charge and leading the environmental review and planning efforts, leading public outreach, and ensuring transparency for the public, because the last thing we want is to try and secretly do anything that people don't know about. We want to make sure that it's completely transparent and above table on everything that we're doing. Responsible for managing the program budget and also the schedule. And then we annually report the progress to the state legislature and have updates to different accounts where other people can find out what's happening on the project, which I'll identify for you in 2 slides from now. And then direct oversight and review of the work of a Delta Conveyance Authority to ensure compliance with state design requirements and specifications. Now that DCA, or the Delta Conveyance Design and Construction Authority, they are a public entity with governance by their own appointed board, which is representative of the participating water agencies in the project. And the DCA's duties are project design and engineering in support of the EIR, EIS process and impact analysis, and also permit acquisitions. They also manage our stakeholder engagement committee, and they are in charge of the design through all the PS&E packages and reviews and the advertising of those programs, and then they'll perform the construction oversight and project management services. Ways to stay informed if anybody is ever interested in what's going on with Delta Conveyance Project. There's 4 identified locations where you can check in, either through the internet, a hotline where you can call in and ask a question, leave a question, and it'll be answered. There's a Twitter account, and then also an email where answers can be secured. And those are available anytime for anybody. And that takes care of my presentation, so I'm going to stop sharing and take it back to Diana. Diana, I think you're on mute.
Thank you for that, Steve. Tony, your presentation is so important. The Delta is literally the heart of California's water system. Now, hopefully, Steve Ritchie is able to join us with his presentation, Assistant GM for San Francisco Public Utilities Commission. And there he is. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you, Diana. And I will share my screen now and get up here to the presentation. I appreciate being invited and being here as part of the program, preparing our water infrastructure for the next 100 years. I'm going to talk about the San Francisco system and the challenges we face. It's a regional water system that basically spans the width of California. It's anchored by 3 reservoirs in the Sierra, Hetchy Reservoir, Lake Eleanor, and Lake Lloyd, 2 reservoirs in Alameda County, San Antonio and Calaveras, and then 3 reservoirs on the peninsula. It's a very large system. It's a very old system. It is largely driven by gravity. So that is a great thing. It makes it fun to be responsible for. But it's also a very old system. The dams in the peninsula were all built before 1900. The earliest built in 1866 in the Alameda, Santa Clara area. We did just rebuild Calaveras Dam because it was originally built in 1925, and also has our youngest dam in San Antonio, which was built in 1964. And then Hetchy in the Sierra was built in 1923, and Lake Eleanor Dam was built in 1918. Our customers are about 2.7 million people, about 900,000 of them in San Francisco and 1.8 million outside of San Francisco, represented by 26 wholesale customers that are shown here in this diagram. The darkest blue are the ones who get the most of their water from us, down to the white. So for example, Hayward there in the north is very dark blue because he gets all of its water from San Francisco, while just south of that white area is the Alameda County Water District, which only gets about 20% of its water from us. This is a schematic of the system, which shows, basically the pipes and tunnels and reservoirs shrunk down a little bit to fit on the screen here. And also, importantly, the three north-south red lines there that are kind of jagged are the earthquake faults our system crosses. So that makes for a real challenge of engineering. But basically, water comes from the Sierra, flows through hydroelectric powerhouses, crosses the San Joaquin Valley. It doesn't have to be filtered from Yosemite, but it does have to be disinfected, which we do in the San Joaquin Valley with an ultraviolet treatment facility. And then it comes through tunnels into the Bay Area proper, and that gold area is, again, an outline of our customer area. So that's the basics of the system. But what I really want to talk about is what the challenges are that we faced. Because we do face many challenges into the future. And they're listed on these two slides. This is the bulk of what I'll talk about. Environmental regulation is really a big deal right now, especially related to the Bay Delta system. We are covered by phase 1 of the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan, and we actually have chosen to sue the State Water Board over that as a way to protect ourselves while we try to put together a voluntary agreement with the state. And that's proving to be challenging. We've been working at it for 2+ years now, and it's not moving very fast. And will there be more regulations in the future? Very much potentially. Workforce development. We have an aging workforce, and then we have to deal with the new generations of workers. They work differently than we have in the past. And so the transitions as we move into areas where people are just learning on the job is going to be a big deal for us. It has been a big deal even already. Climate change and extreme events. The new normal is anything but. We had a flood in March of 2018 at Moccasin, which was one of our small reservoirs, a regulating reservoir. We had basically the design flood come down upon us. We're just starting to rebuild that dam, and we'll be building a new dam probably in the not too distant future, actually probably a new spillway. Our aging infrastructure, as I said, a lot of it is more than 100 years old. We have made a lot of recent investments. We've invested $4.8 billion in seismic and redundancy projects, and those have been starting to come into play for us, but we will need reinvestment even beyond that, looking into the next 100 years. Water quality is always a concern. What's the next contaminant du jour? Right now, a lot of people are facing PFAS, and that was something that wasn't really on anybody's radar screen, and they're going to be more like that as we get more sophisticated in our investigation techniques in the future. Lands management is a big deal for us. We own 60,000 acres of land in the Bay Area, and wildfires are a big concern. In fact, one of the wildfires that happened in August burned roughly 2/3 of our Calaveras Reservoir watershed. So wildfires are a very real thing for us, and we have to deal with that. And I love that little cartoon off to the right. It's an editorial cartoon from the Chronicle back in the Rim Fire, which shows one person saying, "Why should we care about wildfires way over in the Sierra?" And the other balloon is, "Why is smoke coming out of our cold water faucet?" So wildfires are a big deal for us. We have to be on top of that. Water supply diversification. We've relied on the Hetch Hetchy supply for a long time, but we know we need to diversify. We've started to use groundwater in San Francisco as a small portion of our supply, and we're looking at recycled water and even purified water, converting it directly to drinking water in the future. Safety is a big issue. We all had the wake-up call of Oroville. So for San Francisco, we put together a 15-year plan that calls for about $1 billion in investment in our dams throughout the system, because we have many dams, and as I said, many of them are quite old. New facilities, equipment, and technologies. Things are constantly changing and accelerating. There are all kinds of new things happening that we've gone from having, plumbers and stationary engineers being the most important people working for us, now to electronic maintenance techs are almost the most important people working for us. So it's a brave new world we're in. And lastly, water rates and affordability. All of these things cost money, but who should or can pay for it? We tend to be in a very well-off service area, including parts of Silicon Valley and San Francisco, but income disparity between different groups is huge. In San Francisco, we have about 20% of our customers who are within 200% of the poverty line. They don't have a lot of income. We're kind of lacking a middle class. People are either very wealthy or not wealthy at all. So how do we come up with a way to make sure that people can afford to pay their water and sewer bill, and make sure that we can make all these investments for all these challenges that we're facing? That is the quick once-over of San Francisco and our challenges, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Steve. You have well outlined the difficulties faced all of California's retail water suppliers. Now is the time for panel discussion. Panelists, if you could please turn your camera and mics on so that we can start that discussion. And while you're doing so, I'm going to go ahead and start us off with the question. The first question is, with regard to the need for water infrastructure investment, the public sees and experiences deteriorating roads and thus has much better understanding of the need to invest in transportation infrastructure, as exemplified by the passage of SB 1 and the defeat of the proposition was put on the ballot to terminate it. However, they don't see most water infrastructure. How best to communicate to our residents and for state initiatives, our statewide voters, of the need to invest in water infrastructure?
Well, I'll start. Basically, talking about the age of our system really goes a long way for people, because they recognize that when something's 100 years old or more, that there is a need there. And secondly, I have an advantage or a disadvantage being able to point to those major earthquake faults that we all have to live with in the Bay Area. So constantly reminding people about that and making sure we get people out to see the system. That has been something that we've tried to do a lot of. Get people to touch and feel and see it in person, and they become ambassadors then to others. So there's lots of different ways you can do this, but constant reminders that it's an old system and it's seismically at risk.
Yeah, I'd like to join with that in thinking about creative ways that we do that during the coronavirus epidemic, because we're still going to be in this, sadly, for a long time in 2021, as once we get to vaccine approval, distribution is going to take some time. So really thinking about how do you do those Delta flyovers and get people to understand the system? How can we embed that in curriculums? I was just thinking, I'd really love to get together, not just law students, but of course, high school students and others to really understand where our water comes from and the whole concept of infrastructure. We've, of course, seen a lot of attention to infrastructure on the electric side, particularly as we've had wildfires. But getting people to understand it's not just the century mark, but we have a lot of stuff that's hitting the 50-year mark, and that basically we're talking about real physical erosion that can erode our safety and reliability. So I think talking to people about why that infrastructure is so critical and why that investment is needed, but also talking to our elected officials, both at the state level and at the national level, to really make an opportunity to harness this opportunity for infrastructure investment, both at the system level, like the water project, and at the local level.
Yeah, if I may, Diana, I agree both with what Catherine and Stephen have mentioned. The water education is such a big part of understanding and having an ability to know what it is that the whole water system means to the state of California. I've done a number of presentations to classrooms on career days, especially when my children were going through junior high and high school. And the starting discussion is, if you turn your faucet on, where does the water come from? And it's almost less than 5% of the kids have a clue, other than it just comes out of the tap. And so starting at the grassroots, I think, with kids in school at the junior high and high school levels, if we could tap that I think within 10 years, you'd have a much different understanding throughout populace of California as far as the importance of water, where it comes from, and why investment in it is so critical. It's not going to get cheaper. There's no way it can get cheaper because the state's going to continue to grow in its population. And the facilities, as everybody's identified in each of their presentations, we have aging infrastructure. It's going to be cheaper to fix what we've got than to put something new in place, but we're going to have to continue to develop new resources to mount up against the population that's going to be 40 million to 50 million sometime soon. And so we're going to have to address that here at some point. And baseline education for the state's residences, I think, is very critical, and I don't think we do a very good job of it. And at the state, we have, with the State Water Project, we have 3 visitor centers that typically receive kids that come, and they do a fantastic job as far as educating water and where water comes from and how much water is needed to supply not just drinking water, but food for California.
I have to agree. In my small town of 26, operated in 18 on council, we have fully replaced 3 small bores that serve our city. And before doing so, we literally took our residents to see our very deteriorating and dilapidated reservoirs, which literally had the roofs caving in on them. Persuasive visual for our residents to understand. We also, in the course of doing some street repair, excavated some old water pipeline that was intact, very rusted, showed some holes basically, and it helped us. Unfortunately now, my city is looking at, we're approaching $50 million in capital investment for our small town of 26,000. So as a result, our rates have more than doubled during my term here on council. Which brings me to my next question, and this is just a reminder for our conference attendees. We're waiting for any questions that you have. I know there was one. You can click on the arrow on the right-hand side of your screen, go to the Q&A tab, and enter any questions there. But we know that the cost of water will continue to increase due to the need to replace and rehabilitate aging infrastructure and, as we've heard today, build new infrastructure to address the effects of climate change and also to address increasingly stringent water quality requirements for drinking water and also for stormwater. How do we keep the cost of water reasonably affordable, especially for our lower income residents? You can live without electricity. It'd be difficult, but it can be done. It's not possible without water. How do we address that?
Well, I think we certainly need to think about both conservation and infrastructure as we also prepare for the next drought. And this is part of what we also did starting from the first Brown administration, the second Brown administration, and working with all the apparatuses of the state as well as all the localities and tribes to think about long-term water resources. Because in fact, I also teach energy law, so I was just teaching a class on Wednesday about the water energy nexus. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we talked about was that how the drought really escalated the price of water. So whereas often water was bought before the drought for about $250 per acre foot, during the worst of the drought, water, if you could even find a contract for water, was going for over $2,000 an acre foot. So suddenly desal was in the money. So thinking big about how do we promote water resources, which also may be like kind of thinking sideways. Things like invasive tree species are part of what actually prohibit more water from being harnessed through the Delta. Also looking at, working with our partners, we actually had, using Zoom, Chairman Buster Atterbury, who's the chairman of the Karuk tribe, spoke to my class about some of the practices that they have long used for water management and forest management. So thinking about that and about conservation, but the reality is that we also need to make investments in that basic infrastructure. And if you don't make the investments, you can have catastrophic flooding that also can create destruction at, whether we're talking about what happened with UCLA and Poly Pavilion, but can also wreak havoc in local areas or on a bigger scale, or even cause problems with human health. So there really has to be a balance, but America knows that this problem is so big and that we're really far behind, which is why I think we need to look at as well, how do we change the paradigm to promote more state and national investment in water infrastructure and really security for our future.
We can certainly hope that our respective political parties will come together in the next session of Congress for an infrastructure bill. We're going to go to one question, and that is, how can we tie water conservation to stormwater management? And there's a specific reference to the NPDES permit, which I assume might mean MS4 permits, Municipal Storm Sewer System. This is a great challenge for the permittees.
Is that the end of the question, Diana?
That's
Okay.
it.
Yeah, so that is a very opportunistic opportunity for future water planning when we're looking at flood control and flood control facilities and having appropriate detention or retention facilities on those basins so that we can capture some of that stormwater and plan water basins as a community rather than an isolated shed. Then I think we go a long way as far as making sure we've got the ability to capture some of those water. One of the things that we've been looking at on the State Water Project standpoint, and it's just very conceptual with the Central Valley and the subsidence issues that we're looking at. Some of the alternatives that are being addressed is the ability to capture some of that stormwater in those isolated sheds and possibly using State Water Project facilities to wheel that water to different locations. We know that in some of those sheds, we do have overflow facilities when there are large inundation flows that come from the coastal range off the eastern side that flow toward the State Water Project. That is a buffer, and some of the undercrossings aren't big enough, so it is designed to capture some of that water and transport it in the future. One of the options that's just available, but it's a new science that we haven't really looked at it. There's the opportunity for recharge in those basins as we capture that water to help those that are using conjunctive use and have surface water sources from State Water Project, and also their groundwater sources, and also their surface water sources on their impoundments on their individual watersheds. It's just another way of making sure that we're looking to the future on being able to try and capture whatever's available and ensuring that we don't degrade or minimize the downstream flow requirements and the in-stream flow requirements that we need to keep the rivers safe and secure, but also any excess that we can identify that we could use for water in the future.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Moderator Diana, Catherine, Stephen, and Tony, of course, for your rich discussion. We need to wrap this up right now and move on to our next panel. So again, thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.